Well, welcome once again. My name is Doug, one of the pastors here. And over the past few weeks, I've just kept coming back over and over and over to this 5-word phrase, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus. Fix our eyes on Jesus. And I've been doing my best with that. I've been trying really hard, but I got to be honest, it's been hard to do. It just seems that every day that something else gets shut down or locked up or closed up, it just keeps getting harder to do that, to keep our attention and our focus on Him. So one of the things that we've been doing around here in order to help us keep our eyes fixed on Him is we've been looking more at who Jesus is. Not just what He does, but who He is. Specifically, we've been looking at some of the things that Jesus actually says about Himself. Because Jesus says some absolutely incredible things about Himself. And I believe that if we pay attention to the things that Jesus says about Himself, that'll actually help us better understand who it is we are fixing our eyes on. So 2 weeks ago, we looked at John chapter 6, and we talked about the reality that Jesus says that He is the bread of life. And then last week we looked at John chapter 10 where Jesus reveals that He's the good shepherd. And then this morning we're going to look at John chapter 11 where Jesus says something amazing. He says this, He says, I am the resurrection and the life. And so the beautiful truth that you and I are going to unpack this morning is this, that because Jesus is the resurrection and the life, we have hope for this life and hope beyond this life. And so I want to start by saying something. I want to start by making a statement just to kind of get us started this morning. And it's a statement that I'm going to come back to in a few minutes towards the end of this message, but I want to say it now so you have it in your minds. So I want to say this, because my tomorrow is secure, my today isn't scary. Think about that for just a sec, and I want you to hold that in your mind because we're going to come back to it in just a few minutes. Because my tomorrow is secure, my today isn't scary. Okay, so with that, let me ask you this question. Have you ever been in a hurry, but the person you're with isn't? Have you ever had that experience where you're in a hurry, you're trying to get somewhere, you're trying to get out the house on time, and the person you're with just doesn't seem to care, just isn't in as big of a hurry as you are? I guarantee if you are married or you have kids, you have had that experience, right? Where you're trying to get to work on time or trying to get to church on time or trying to get somewhere on time, and the person you're with, your spouse or your kids, just don't seem to care, just don't seem to be sharing your sense of urgency, right? So you have probably had, you've seen husbands waiting on wives, or you've seen wives waiting on husbands. I've seen parents waiting on kids, right? How long does it take to tie your shoe? We gotta go. But I've also seen kids waiting on parents, right? Mom, you said we were gonna leave at 9 and it's 9:05, right? So we've seen that. And it's one thing being in a hurry when other people aren't. That's super frustrating. It's another thing being in an emergency when other people aren't. That can be downright scary. And I actually had that experience myself. So picture this. I'm 7 years old, okay? I'm supposed to be babysitting just for a few minutes my 3-year-old little brother, Brian. My mom had an important phone call that she needed to take, and so she had just asked me to keep an eye on my brother just for a couple minutes while she was on this phone call. So being the brilliant older brother that I am, I thought it would be a perfect time for my brother and I to go climb into our brand new family car and play in the front seat. Right? It had all of these knobs and all these dials and all these instruments and controls. And for me, it was like being in a cockpit, sitting in the driver's seat. I was like, man, I'm like sitting in a spaceship in Star Wars, right? So we sat down and we just started playing. We're turning knobs and turning dials and we're pressing buttons. And of course the car isn't on, so nothing's actually working until I put the car in reverse. And then suddenly that car literally begins to back down our inclined driveway. We lived on a corner, and so it backed down and rolled down right into the middle of the street, right? My brother's looking out the window. He's got a big smile on his face. This is all fun for him. But I'm old enough to recognize this is a bad situation. And so I did what any good big brother would do. I jumped out of the car, slammed the door, left my little brother in the car, and went running into the house. I'm running in to try to find my mom. and tell her what's going on. So I run inside, I find my mom, she's still on the phone, and I'm trying to get the words out. I'm out of breath, I'm freaking out. I'm like, Mom, Brian, car, right? And she can't tell what I'm saying, and so she gives me one of these. She's on the phone, and she's listening to me sort of blabber, and she just looks at me and goes, wait, right? And I'm like, no, I can't wait. You don't understand what's going on. And I was so frustrated. I remember being so desperate and so scared and so frustrated because my mom wasn't dropping everything to respond to this emergency like I thought she should. And that is exactly what happens here in John chapter 11 in this story that we're going to read about two desperate sisters and their dying brother. So if you have your Bibles, I'm going to invite you to turn to the book of John chapter 11. If you have a Bible app on your phone, you can go ahead and turn there. And I'm just going to ask you to go to John chapter 11. John is one of the four Gospels. There's four books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that deal with the reality of who Jesus was, what he said, what he did, and who he revealed himself to be. And so in John chapter 11, we pick up this story in verse 1, and we read this. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village that Mary and her sister Martha, that is Mary, the one whose brother now lay sick. This was the same Mary who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus saying, Lord, the one you love is sick. When Jesus heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. And listen to what he says here. He says something really powerful. He says, no, it is for God's glory so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Now remember that because we're going to come back to that a few minutes later. But here's where we get to a part of the story that just doesn't seem to make any sense. Verse 5, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. And we read that and we go, wait, what? Wait, Jesus loved them, so he stayed 2 more days? That doesn't make any sense. Why would he stay 2 more days? If Jesus loved them, why didn't he drop everything and rush right away to the little village of Bethany where Lazarus was dying? If he really loved them, then why would he let these 2 poor sisters suffer as their brother eventually died? Some of us know exactly what that's like. Some of you have cared for a loved one through the final stages of life, and it sucks. It's hard. It's traumatic. I've watched people die. I've literally been by the bedside holding on to a hand as people I care about suffer and gasp for air and die. One of my friends is a hospice nurse, and so she sees this all the time. And the hardest part is the family that's left behind, the family members that are left with their sorrow and their sadness that they now have to deal with. And so we read this part of the story, and we can't help but think, wait a minute, if Jesus really loved Martha, if Jesus really loved Mary, in fact, if Jesus actually really did love Lazarus, why did he wait? Right? Why didn't he drop everything and rush to the village of Bethany to keep Lazarus from dying? Well, here's my answer. Jesus waited because he had something even better planned for them. I want to say that again. Jesus waited because he had something even better planned for them. Jesus waited because he wanted to give Mary and Martha, and especially Lazarus, a front row seat to the unveiling of his real plan. Now you hear that and you go, wait, what real plan? What do you mean real plan? Let me explain. See, up to that point, Jesus was well known primarily as a traveling teacher and as a miracle worker. And people liked him for those reasons. People were attracted to him for those reasons. People followed him for those reasons. In fact, when Jesus would show up in a new town, people would flock to see this teacher and listen to him teach and to see if maybe he would perform a miracle or heal somebody or heal somebody of their sickness or their blindness. But Jesus, in this moment, was about to go next level. Jesus was about to reveal his real purpose, his real plan, his real reason coming to earth. And his real reason was more than just to be a teacher. His real reason was more than just to do miracles. His real reason was salvation. His real reason was to be a savior, not just a teacher, not just a miracle worker, but a savior. And so he waits. For 2 days, he waits. And while he waits, Lazarus dies. And Mary and Martha, they don't understand. They cry and they sob and they weep and they think to themselves, why didn't Jesus come? Why didn't Jesus show up? Why didn't he even answer? We thought he loved us. We thought he loved our brother. Why didn't he even show up? And there isn't a single one of us that doesn't know what that feels like. There isn't a single one of us that at some point in our life haven't asked God the exact same questions. God, why did you wait? Why didn't you show up? Why did you let that happen? Why didn't you answer? And so Jesus lets 2 full days go by. And then he rounds up his disciples and he tells them that they're going to return to the region of Judea. The region of Judea contained the small village of Bethany, where Mary and Martha were, and Lazarus, and it contained the capital city of Jerusalem. And so the moment that he tells his disciples that they're going back to that area, they get pretty nervous because they remember what happened the last time they were in that region. The last time they were in that region, Jesus was in Jerusalem and he almost got killed. In fact, people had picked up stones and were about to kill Jesus, and so they barely escaped with their lives. And so they are understandably very nervous and anxious about this idea, this plan that Jesus proposes of going back to the region of Judea. But Jesus doesn't care. He says to them this. He says, listen, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, and I am going there to wake him up. And so we pick the story back up in verse 12. His disciples replied, well, Jesus, if he sleeps, then he'll get better. But Jesus had been speaking of Lazarus' death, but his disciples thought that Jesus meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, guys, Lazarus is dead. And then he says something really peculiar. He says, and for your sake, I'm glad I was not there so that you may believe. So let's go to him. Verse 15, let me just stop there. Verse 15 is another one of those verses that at first it doesn't seem to make any sense, right? Like you read it and you're going, wait, Jesus, you're glad you weren't there when Lazarus died? Like what kind of a messed up friend are you that you didn't even want to be there? But then Jesus gives his disciples a little taste, a little hint of what he has planned. He says to them, listen, guys, no, it's for your sake that I'm glad I wasn't there. Because this way, you're going to get to see something and witness something and experience something so incredible, so radical, so powerful, it will literally change and transform everything about what you believe. And so they go. We pick it back up in verse 17. On his arrival to the region, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. And when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she ran out to meet him, but Mary stayed home. Let me just stop there for just a second. It's not that Martha cared more or that Mary just didn't want to see Jesus. This was actually part of Jewish tradition. In Jewish tradition, the family members of the deceased would actually stay in their home. They wouldn't go out of their home. They wouldn't go shopping. They wouldn't go anywhere or really do much of anything for the first 30 days. And so Mary and Martha had just been staying in the home. In fact, Mary was planning on staying in this house for like 30 straight days and not going anywhere. Can you imagine what that would be like to stay in your house for 30 straight days? Oh yes, you absolutely can imagine what that would be like. But that's what Mary is planning to do. But Martha hears that Jesus is coming, and so she runs out to meet him. And when she gets to Jesus, Jesus isn't even in the village yet, and Martha runs out to meet him, and she is not happy. In fact, listen to the first words that come out of Martha's mouth. And these are just classic Martha words here. She says, Jesus, if you would have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Jesus, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died. There's no greeting. There's no hello. There's no how was your trip. There's no offer of Gatorade after this long trip, right? I mean, she just comes out firing with this bitter accusation, basically blaming Jesus for the death of her brother. But Jesus doesn't argue. He doesn't get defensive. He simply reassures her with these words. He says, Martha, your brother will rise again. And Martha answers, but she answers almost dismissively. Almost like, yeah, Jesus, I know that he will rise again eventually. And I can't help but feeling like Martha's response is like a lot of Christians in the middle of difficult circumstances, right? Like we get in the middle of difficult circumstances and we just sort of spit out the line or quote the verse or repeat the cliche, but we don't really buy it, right? You ever had one of those moments? It's like Martha had the right answer, but the wrong heart, and Jesus knew it. But Jesus also knew his real purpose. He also knew his real plan, and so he responds to Martha with these powerful words in verse 25. Listen to what he says, and this is the centerpiece of the entire story. He says these words. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. I am the resurrection and the life. Notice here that Jesus doesn't just say, I do resurrections. He doesn't just say, I give life. He says, no, I am the resurrection. I am the life. See, Jesus wasn't just describing what he does. He wasn't just giving the bullet points of his resume. He was describing who he is. I don't know if you watch Pixar movies, but my family and I love Pixar movies. And so there's this one line from the movie The Incredibles where Frozone, who's one of the superheroes, is trying to find his super suit and he can't find it. And you might remember this line.
Super suit?
What?
Where is my super suit?
Put it away.
Where?
Why do you need to know?
I need it.
Don't you think about running off to doing no daring do? We've been planning this dinner for 2 months.
The public is in danger.
My evening's in danger.
You tell me what my suit is, woman. We are talking about the greater good.
Greater good? I am your wife. I'm the greatest good you are ever gonna get.
There it is right there, right? I love that line. I am your wife. I am the greatest good you are ever going to get. I can't tell you how many times my wife has literally quoted that line to me, and she's absolutely right. But that's exactly what Jesus is saying here. Jesus is saying, no, I am the resurrection. But Martha is so preoccupied with what's happening in the moment, with what's going on around her, with what she's feeling on the inside, that she's in danger of missing the reality of who Jesus really is. And the real significance of what's about to happen in this moment isn't just the miracle that Jesus is about to perform. It's what that miracle demonstrates about who Jesus is. Jesus doesn't just do resurrection. He's saying, no, I am the resurrection. In fact, look at the entire statement that Jesus says here in verses 25 and 26. He starts with those words and says, I am the resurrection and the life. And then he says this, and whoever believes in me will live, even if they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Friends, this story about Mary and Martha and Lazarus, this story isn't just about an ancient dead guy and his 2 sisters. This story isn't just about a miracle that Jesus performed 2,000 years ago. This story is about the world-changing reality that Jesus has the power over the one thing that scares us the most, especially right now, death. Every shutdown, every mask, every glove, every person that's staying at home and washing their hands like 50 times a day is all for one purpose, to try to prevent the one thing that none of us has the ability to prevent. And so what Jesus is claiming here in John chapter 11 is that if we believe in him, if we put our faith and our trust and our dependency in him, if we choose to live in him, then you and I will never die. That's the promise that Jesus is making here in this passage. And so Jesus speaks these words to Martha, but she has a hard time hearing them. Why? Because of everything that's going on around her, right? All she can think about is her dead brother that she just buried 4 days ago. So she can't even hear these words. She can't even respond to this promise because she's so caught up in what it is that she's experiencing. And so she goes and she gets her sister Mary, and together they go with Jesus to the tomb. And we pick up the story in verse 39. Jesus says these words. He says, "Take away the stone." And we know that Martha doesn't quite get it because listen to how she responds. She goes, no, Lord, says Martha, the sister of the dead man. No, by this time there's a bad odor. It's gonna smell. There's a dead body in there. He's already been there 4 days. And Jesus reassures her once again with these words. He says, "Didn't I tell you that if you believe, you're going to see the glory of God?" Jesus knows what he's about to do. And so they took away the stone. And Jesus looked up and said this. He begins to pray loud enough for people to hear. He says, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But I'm saying this for the benefit of the people standing here so that they will believe that you sent me." And when he had said this, Jesus calls out in a loud voice. He says, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man, with his hands and his feet wrapped in strips of linen and a cloth wrapped around his head, literally comes walking out like this zombie apocalypse scene, right? This mummy sort of walking out. And Jesus said to them, "Take off those grave clothes and let him go." He didn't need the grave clothes anymore because he was no longer in the grave. Friends, here's the thing about that story. It's a great story. It's especially a great story, if you think about it, for Martha and for Mary, because they got their brother back, at least for a few more years. But here's the hard reality about this story. Eventually, Lazarus still died. And so did Martha, and so did Mary. And so if all this story is a story about two sisters getting a few more years with their brother, then who cares? Like if that's all this story is why do I care with all that's going on in the world right now? Why do I care about an ancient dead guy and his two dead sisters? Why do I care? Let me tell you why. Because I am convinced that this is far more than an ancient story about a 2,000-year-old miracle. This story is a foreshadowing of the greatest event in all of human history. See, ultimately, this miracle wasn't even really about Lazarus or Martha or Mary, which is exactly what Jesus had told his disciples back in verse 4. He said, no, there's a reason that I want you to see this. But it wasn't about Lazarus, and it wasn't really about Martha, and it wasn't really about Mary or alleviating their sadness or their sorrow. This miracle wasn't about them. This miracle is actually all about Jesus and all about his glory and his power and who he is. It's about Jesus demonstrating not just what he can do, but who he is, who he was then, and who he is now. It was a tiny little demonstration of the reality that through Jesus' death and resurrection 2 weeks later, that salvation and eternal life were being offered free to all of humanity. That's the truth of this story. And this miracle in chapter 11 is like Jesus tipping his hand and kind of showing us what he's got. It's like Jesus giving us a little sneak peek into what he's about to do. That's what this is. It's like when I would arm wrestle my kids when they were little. Like when my kids were 5 and 6, Daddy, we want to arm wrestle, right? And so I'd put out my arm, they'd stick out their little spindly arms, right? And they would grab onto my arm and we'd arm wrestle, and at first they're struggling, right? And I'm just holding it and I'm letting them almost get me. Oh, you almost got me. And every once in a while, just to demonstrate that at any moment I could completely annihilate them in this arm wrestling. I would sort of snap my arm back, just almost win, and then I'd let them fight and wrestle for a while and just show them just how strong I actually was compared to them. And that's what Jesus is doing here. Jesus is demonstrating his power and victory over death, and he's giving us a little hint and a little clue and a little foreshadowing and a little taste about what's to come. This miracle is Jesus showing Mary and showing Martha and showing Lazarus and showing the disciples and showing the crowd and showing me and showing you that Jesus has power over death. The one thing that scares us the most, particularly in a moment like this, that through his death and resurrection, we have instant, immediate access to God's grace, to God's mercy, to his forgiveness, to his love, to salvation and eternal life. And all of this is available to me and available to you. Why? Because Jesus is the resurrection and the life. I said something at the beginning that I want to say here at the end as we wrap up. I said it this way. I said, because my tomorrow is secure, my today isn't scary. Friends, today, like right now with everything that's going on around us, has lots of reasons to be scary. But I believe that because my tomorrow is secure, my today doesn't actually have to be scary. Think about it. We've all had moments where we look back on the past and we think, oh my gosh, if I knew then what I knew now, what I know now, I would do things completely differently, right? I wouldn't have dated that guy. I wouldn't have worn those clothes or had that hairstyle in middle school, or I would have invested in Apple back in the 80s, right? Like there's things we would have done differently if we knew then what we know now. Friends, Jesus has already revealed the future. We don't have to wonder about what the future holds anymore. We don't have to wait in fear and apprehension and worry and anxiety about what might possibly happen, because Jesus has already revealed the future. His statement in John chapter 11, verses 25 and 26 has already shown what we can expect. And because our future is secure, we don't have to live in fear today. We don't have to freak out every time someone around us coughs. We don't have to cling with every fiber of our being to our stuff and to every minute of this life. We can live with confidence and hope. We can be generous and unselfish. Why? Because my tomorrow is secure. My today isn't very scary. So I want to close this morning with some old lyrics from an old Southern gospel song. It's a song by Bill and Gloria Gaither, and when Gloria wrote this song, she looked back and describes sort of the experience that she had when she wrote the lyrics that I'm going to read to you in just a moment. She said this, she said, my husband Bill was really sick, and our life, and really the whole world, was just in chaos. Sound familiar? She says this, she says, the civil rights movement was going on, there was racial tension, the city of Watts had just burned to the ground, and the whole country was split apart over the Vietnam War. On top of that, she says, we just found out that we were having a baby, and we thought, who would want to bring a baby into a world like this? We were just so disturbed by the whole thing. She says that she was sitting alone in her house one evening, dealing with this fear and this apprehension, this anxiety and this concern about her husband's health and about everything that was going on in the world. And she said this feeling just washed over her where she became so amazed and enraptured by the reality of the resurrection, that in her mind, because of the reality of the resurrection, she could trust Jesus now with the stuff that was going on now in her life. And it was in that moment that she wrote the words to this famous song. And those words go like this: because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, all fear is gone. Because I know that he holds the future, life is worth living because he lives.